Hello, my name is Reva Bhalla, and today I'm joined by our military analyst, Floyd, to talk about Operation Protective Edge and its aftermath. Paul, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so today, so far, we have an Egyptian-mediated ceasefire. Israel has accepted. The Palestinian militant factions have so far refused. And we have rocket attacks that appear to be continuing.
Yeah, since the 9 a.m. ceasefire local time went into place, we've had about 100 rockets so far, and they're continuing as we speak to continue to be launched. And the IDF has resumed airstrikes, about 30 so far.
And so far we've seen Israel, it's very reluctant to go into a ground assault. I think we find that still unlikely given the constraints. What are the major challenges that Israel faces in trying to even contemplate a ground assault?
Well, the big thing is going into a densely populated urban environment, which would kind of negate a lot of the advantages the IDF has that's kind of been casualty averse. And so they can probably go in. They've got the military power to go into Gaza. The problem is if they go in, this urban fighting that I'm referencing will cause a large number of casualties. And so are they willing to bear that cost?
Right.
And that seems like something they really considering the ultimate military objective they want to achieve right now, that cost benefit doesn't seem to be there.
And there's only so much you can do by air when it comes to the Israeli military objective of actually neutralizing the rocket supply that Palestinian militant factions have, specifically of those long-range rockets.
Right. So like right now, basically, airstrikes can only hit the launching sites. So anything they can identify through ISR or as they're seeing them launched. Okay. But that's kind of reactive, if you will. It's not preventative. And any of those sites they may have documented beforehand since they watch Gaza pretty consistently. The problem is the storage. The storage of the rockets probably are in these dense urban environments like Gaza City proper, Rafah City. And so a ground operation would be the only viable option to actually go in there and dig out because a lot of these, there's a lot of tunnel networks as well, and dig out a lot of these supply depots and manufacturing depots where these rockets would be located. And airstrikes cannot do that. Either physically they can't accomplish that, or there's going to be a preponderance of civilian casualties, which also constrains Israel's actions.
So looking at this from Hamas's perspective, right, they're rejecting the ceasefire so far. They're trying to at least demonstrate some sort of symbolic victory over Israel. But let's look at the military reality. What do we see in terms of the military objectives having been achieved or not achieved on both the Israeli and the Hamas sides?
Well, Hamas's military options, at least as it stands now, are very limited. I mean, basically, they're limited to these rocket strikes that disrupt life, can cause a handful of casualties, but the rocket systems are so crude that they really, at best, can basically make air raid sirens go off and disturb daily life of Israeli citizens. And so Hamas is, and then Iron Dome, the air defense system that has been designed specifically to deal with these rockets, has reportedly performing between 85 and 95% effectiveness, and really eliminating a lot of this threat as well. So again, it's disturbing Israel's way of life, but it's not necessarily causing that parity of casualties.
And how would you compare that to 2012?
2012 still was not necessarily equitable, but even then they were able to at least get a little bit under 5 deaths on the Israeli side in a similar amount of time, and the Palestinian casualties were a little bit less. So over time, what we're seeing, at least in this operation so far, this operation seems to even be more disproportionately in Israel's favor from a military point of view.
But overall, what we're saying is that neither Hamas nor Israel are able to achieve their military objectives in these conflicts. Right?
Absolutely. So the big thing is Israel is kind of balanced between, yes, like the rocket fire is disruptive, but going into Gaza, which would answer that problem and really answer that military objective, would have a much, much higher cost than what they're saying. Right now, they're basically having a cost in resources and money, specifically. That is much more tenable than going in and losing, having soldiers kidnapped and IED'd and all that other cost that's associated with going there, not to mention the amount of civilian casualties that naturally occur when you do urban fighting and the political international ramifications from that.
But of course, there's plenty of political spin that can be applied by both sides to try to demonstrate that this is somewhat of a victory for either side. I think the reality, though, spells a very different picture. And then when we even talk about, say, a ceasefire is met, right? Neither side really wants to escalate the conflict. What happens then? Because the issue of the rockets is still far from resolved.
I think it's much like we saw in 2012, which is just a reset after Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. Rocket fire became almost non-existent for a while and stayed in very, very low numbers. The IDF continued its operations and how it monitors and controls Gaza. And basically there was a year-and-a-half pause. And we see a ceasefire now with kind of nothing necessarily being fixed, if you will, or achieved in these military objectives. Yeah, we're back to the same old status quo.
And we have more players because the old, style of doing things was Hamas and Israel would start fighting, principally those two actors. You had Egypt jump in, mediate. Things would go back to business as usual until it starts up again. Now you have more players, right? Where Iran, as we've seen, they've had a very close military relationship, not just with Hamas, but with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, has ensured a supply line from Iran to Gaza through key countries like Sudan up through the Sinai. And it doesn't look like we're going to see much effectiveness on Egypt's part or in trying to sway Sudan to actually interdicting those supplies.
Yeah, in theory, we've had a more pro-Israeli Egyptian government since the Muslim Brotherhood was removed from power. Right. And they've announced and been very public about how much they've cracked down on smuggling into Gaza, and the rocket fire out of Gaza kind of pretty much contradicts all of that. So the rockets from Iran and sourced through whatever and Sudan are still making it into Gaza despite the outside players' stated intents.
All right. Well, far from resolved, which means we'll be keeping busy at Stratfor. So thank you, Paul, for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.